live.
All right. Welcome. All of our so far almost 400 participants that are logging in, and the numbers increasing. Welcome, Professor Coquiert. Thank you for your time and that you have graciously agreed to participate with us here. This is a live webinar organized by the Saudi Epilepsy Society as part of the academic responsibility of the society and of our professional community here during this COVID-19 crisis. We would like to continue to have scientific conversations and educational activities. I would like to thank Dr. Faisal Al-Utaibi, who is the president of the Saudi Epilepsy Society, for his support. He has recently taken the helm at the society, and he has made tremendous steps forward. And I would also like to thank the board members for their support. This live webinar today is supported by Livanova, so we would like to also thank them for supporting the Saudi Epilepsy Society in accordance with all of the ethical regulations and in meeting the shared goals to help our patients collectively. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the star of the night, our virtually visiting professor from Brazil, Professor Arthur Coquiert. And he will be speaking to us today for 40 minutes or so about modulating epileptic networks, current status, and future directions. And I'm delighted and honored to be moderating this session. My name is Haytham Tayyib, and I am one of the epileptologists here in Jeddah at the King Abdulaziz University and the head of epilepsy over there. And it is really my honor to be side by side, even if pictures on the screen with Professor Coquiert. You can see that he has a distinguished career, really, starting from training in Brazil, and then at the Montreal Neuro Institute, where epilepsy was, much of epilepsy has originated, the land of Penfield. He currently heads the Sao Paulo Epilepsy Clinic and the epilepsy surgery program there, and has tremendous involvement and activities with the International League Against Epilepsy. He has organized many meetings. He was the president of the Functional Neurosurgery Society in Brazil, and he has authored many papers, a few books as well. And if this distinguished resume doesn't convince you of paying the most attention you can, his power as a reviewer should, for the most prominent publications in epilepsy. So if you submit a paper, his eyes are not unlikely going to be looking at it. This is how the night is going to look like. I'm going to end these remarks very soon. Professor Coquiert will give us a talk for 40 minutes or so. In the meantime, please post your questions in the Q&A section, and I will collect them and organize them, and then we'll try to have a discussion for 10-15 minutes subsequently, and then we'll close at 10 sharp, hopefully. Without further delays, Professor Coquiert, it's an honor. Thank you again for your time, and the mic is yours.
Good evening, everyone. I would just like to start by thanking so much for Dr. Al-Utaibi and Tayyib for the kind invitation. I'm really honored to be with you. And what I'll be trying to do is to share some of our views on neuromodulation presently and likely in the future. So, is the presentation right?
and it should be apparent, yes.
Okay, so my objective today would be to review the neurobiology of neuromodulation and to review the different neuromodulation techniques that we are being used for the treatment of refractory epilepsy. I would also like to discuss the outcome and cost effectiveness of neuromodulation and to elaborate with you on the future developments in neuromodulation. Neuromodulation in epilepsy right now is a kind of a broad field, and basically we could divide it in extracranial neuromodulation and intracranial neuromodulation. Vagus nerve stimulation being the main extracranial neuromodulation technique. And as for intracranial neuromodulation, we could do either focus stimulation, like when we stimulate the cortex or the hippocampus, or spreading related stimulation, basically when we stimulate the thalamus. And in the thalamus, we have different targets. So, first of all, how important is this thing? Well, as you can see, there has been a huge increase in the number of papers regarding brain stimulation for treatment of epilepsy over the last years. It began to increase by the time when VNS was first introduced in the market, but over the last years, we can see a boom of publication and interest in neuromodulation. So this is something that we are going to be hearing more and more in the future. The neurobiology and the pathophysiology of brain stimulation is not yet fully understood, but some things we know. And I think if we start thinking about those things, we could be able in the future to better develop techniques and targets and paradigms for stimulation. The first thing we need to know is that it's easier to stimulate axons than cell bodies. So when you have an electrode in the nucleus, you're expected to stimulate more easily axons that are passing through the nucleus than the neurons that are actually being there in the nucleus. And this is very important because if what you like is axon activation, you can use lower intensity. But if what you're thinking about is neuronal activation or blocking, you need to stimulate in a different way. So the first thing we need to realize is that axons and neurons are different in terms of how we are able to stimulate that. And this means that the first thing that we're going to get when you stimulate any point of the brain is a significant amount of effects related to distant relays, which means that you're getting the effects of axonal stimulation before you get the results of neuronal stimulation. We also know, since we are stimulating initially axons, that the short latency recruiting response are immediately antidromic. You stimulate an axon and it goes direct to the cell body of the same axon. And the long latency recruiting responses are orthodromic. It moves forward in a transsynaptic way, and the effects might be polysynaptic. So it's different. Not only it's axons different than neurons, but then the effects, orthodromic and antidromic effects, might be different. So every single of these things had to be taken into consideration. The mechanisms of actions in neuromodulation might include increasing inhibition rates, decreasing excitation rates, altering rhythmic patterns without inhibition or excitation, modifying the way information is transferred in the transsynaptically, and simply overriding regular rhythms. So there are a lot of things that the neuromodulation could do, and we need to, in the future, to learn how to interfere in each of these paradigms that I have just mentioned. In epilepsy and for instance, in Parkinson's disease and any other disease, we are seeking inhibition. And to achieve inhibition, we can do it by depolarization blocks, inactivations of voltage-gated currents, or activation on inhibitory efferents. But this is what you want. But basically, when we are doing this in humans with using the current settings and hardware, we rarely get a complete inhibition. What we get is an incomplete inhibition and neuromodulation of this network. It's when you stimulate the GPI for Parkinson's disease or the STN for Parkinson's disease, you are not inhibiting the whole thing. You are modulating the basal ganglia network, but you are not inhibiting the whole thing. And this is also true for hippocampal stimulation, because we can perform bilateral hippocampal stimulation with high voltages, and you don't get memory deficits. This means you are modulating the system, but you are not totally inhibiting it. And this is one of the beauties of the thing, because it's not analogous to resection. It's a different way of thinking, it's a different way of acting. I like to show this. This is a nice work coming from Ghent, which was the first one that showed on the importance of the noradrenergic system in seizure control. We are used to think of seizure control based on diminishing the excitation or increasing the inhibition, which is basically glutamate and GABA. But then it comes this kind of paper that show us that other systems, in this case the noradrenergic system, is important. And this is a change in paradigm. And this is the kind of thing that modulation is bringing up. And it's going to be very important when we get, for instance, for VNS, which basically use a noradrenergic system activation method for seizure control. The other thing we need to know is that when you are activating a system, let's say actions in the system, you're going to be activating both inhibitory and excitatory pathways. And the net result would depend on which nucleus you are doing it and how you are doing it. So the same nucleus can give you very different results if you do it one way or if you do it in another way, if you change from high frequency to low frequency. So it's like in the rest of the brain. The net activity depends on inhibitory and excitatory pathways. The other thing that I'd like to call your attention is that we are very focused on axons and neurons, but please don't forget the astrocytes. They have a tremendously effective regulatory function in vascular coupling and extracellular matrix composition in the brain. And they might also be included in the seizure control systems. And adenosines, for instance, have been implicated in seizure control in many animal studies, but not yet proven in humans. Oops. There is a progressive long-term improvement during neuromodulation. This can apply to DBS, but this also applies to VNS. We expect that our patients get better with time. And this has been documented in many papers, both regarding DBS and VNS. And why is that? Well, we think that this is because we have both hodologic or connectivity effects, and we have a molecular or cellular-based effects. And by that I'm meaning rewiring due to the anti-epileptic effects and improvement of visual cycling of stimulation due to the seizures, like a kindling type of effect. And this would drive molecular and molecular cellular morphological effects like sprouting that is seen in the hippocampus and in other nuclei, activations of growth factors, and metabolic pathways activation. One of the main metabolic pathways activation that has been studied in a more detailed way is the Mtor Cascade, which we are probably gonna be hearing more and more. And as far as we can understand and modify this kind of cascades, we are probably gonna be using neuromodulation in a more efficient way. This is to show you that the effect that you expect during neuromodulation can vary according to the disease that you are treating. So if you are treating Parkinson's disease, you you can expect results in seconds. You turn the generator on, and the patient is out of tremor, and that's it. But for other pathology and syndromes like epilepsy, you are going to get results in the long terms, mid and long terms, meaning that you cannot expect the neuromodulation to work in the first week or in the first month. You do have to wait for the network to be modulated. And this is very interesting. This comes from Howe's lab at Yale, and it shows you that when you are modulating a system, you are really doing different things regarding different nodes of the network. In here, you see the stimulation of the hippocampus, for instance, or the thalamus. And what you are going to be seeing when you have a complex passive seizure in the rat, what you see in the CL, which is like the anterior nucleus in humans, the central median nucleus in humans, is totally different than what's happening in the anterior nucleus of the animal. The anterior nucleus of the animal is being stimulated, and the central median is being depressed and inhibited. This is because the regular brain activity is also like what the neuromodulation we are doing. You are doing one thing in one nucleus, and you're doing other things in another nucleus. So this is neuromodulation is just how to learn how our brain uses the brain's methodology and try to apply it to solve the patient problem. As I mentioned, you should expect distant activations after you stimulate a single nucleus, and this is the anterior thalamic stimulation, and you see there is widespread activation over the cortex, and this is another thalamic, the central median nucleus, and you also see widespread cortical activation. So you should expect activation in places much far from the stimulated point. The other important thing that we have to take into account, and it's very apparent when you treat these patients, is what we call a carryover effect. A carryover effect is something that is when the patient keeps seizure control when you turn off the generator or the device. You're not going to be seeing, for instance, if you have a patient with DBS or VNS, and then they run out of battery, they're not going to start seizing immediately. They'll take some time for them to start seizing again. And this is the carryover effect. The carryover effect can be longer for one device and one target, and can be shorter for another, but it's very likely that this carry-on effect is always there, and we need to understand it better. One way of understanding this carryover effect and a proof of concept that we are doing something to our patients is what happened to them when they have their generators depleted. And this is one of our publications regarding this. And you can see that most of the patients, the ones in red, they get worse after generator depletion, but this takes weeks or months. And when they start seizing again, they start seizing not back to baseline. So if they had 10 seizures before, and then you stimulate them and they get 1, and when they run out of battery, they don't get back to 10, they get back to 4 or 5, because we did modulate the network. On the other hand, it means that they need to be stimulated for a longer time, but we did modulate the network, and we did have a carryover effect. There are many ways of trying to predict seizures, and entropy is not the only one. There are lots of them that are being considered, but it's just to mention that we need to have our biomarkers for seizure initiation, so that we could teach our neuromodulation devices when and how to interfere. In the ongoing epileptic activity, you see here it's one of our patients implanted with subdural electrodes, and you see seizure initiation in the on the top tracing, and below you see that entropy start to drop before you see it on the EKG. And this is one of the things that can be considered. If we can study and if we can manipulate this kind of data in the future, it will be easier and more feasible for us to develop closed-loop stimulation systems. In summary, I would say that the mechanisms of actions are complex and we do not yet fully understand them, although rapid progress has been made over the last decade, as you've seen from the numbers of published papers. Due its efficacy, limited side effect, and basically its non-lesional nature and totally reversible nature, neuromodulation is likely to be more frequently used in the treatment of patients with refractory epilepsy, especially those in whom resection is not being contemplated or indicated. This is my personal. I now divide it in non-modulatory conventional epilepsy surgery and modulatory epilepsy surgery, then neuromodulation. But neuromodulation is taking more and more space. And right now, I would say that 15 to 20% of what we do is neuromodulation. Regarding deep brain stimulation, I just put the main targets here for you to understand that epilepsy is not an homogeneous disease. And as far as you are going to stimulate a patient, there is no one-fits-all target. It's not like nowadays, for instance, Parkinson's disease is basically a one or two targets. It's either STN or GPI for most of the patients, but this is not true for epilepsy. You're going to have to consider the type of syndrome and seizure that the patient has, and you have to modify your targets according to what the patient has. And then if you are going to stimulate the anterior nucleus, this is going to be basically for frontotemporal epilepsy. If you're going to stimulate the central median, this is for generalized epilepsy because it has a widespread connection to the rest of the brain. And of course, if you're going to stimulate the hippocampus, that's going to be for temporal lobe epilepsy. That means that you are not going to be stimulating the hippocampus in generalized epilepsy, and you are not going to be using the anterior nucleus to treat generalized epilepsy. You have to take into consideration the connectivity and the type of seizures that those patients have. These are the main deep brain stimulation studies. One that was run by Medtronic, the Sante study, and the other one was run by NeuroPace, the responsive neuromodulation studies. And you can see that they have surprisingly very similar results, despite the fact that they were treating different patient populations with different hardware. This is a kind of intriguing, and anyway, both results are similar, and they were responsive, but these responses were not as good as we expected. The other target for DBS is central median stimulation, which is basically used for generalized epilepsy. On the contrary, that the two ones that I have just showed you, it basically has very little effect on focal seizures. So this is something that we are going to be using for generalized epilepsy. And why is that? Because the central median is an early relay for the spread of the spike and wave discharges that are frequently and massively present in patients with generalized epilepsy. The epileptic discharge goes through the central median, but much before they reach, for instance, the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. And that's why in the generalized seizures, central median is better. We have used central median stimulation after callosotomy, patients who failed or have little improvement after callosotomy. And we were able to show that there is a massive improvement after central median stimulation in patients that had already been submitted to callosotomy, meaning something that we are going to be seeing next in the presentation, that the neuromodulation techniques usually adds to the effect of a failed resective or regular procedure. The other issue that we have been studying over the last years is hippocampal Dbs, which we think is very, very promising in patients with temporal lobe epilepsy who are not candidates for surgery or who failed surgery. And this started we performed an open series where we have shown that 4 out of 9 patients became seizure-free. This is much more than those patients who got seizure-free in the Sante in the neuropathy study. And we thought that this might be a much better procedure for these patients in the future. We select patients that are poor candidates for resective surgery, be it for any reason, as I mentioned before, or patients who are not willing, for instance, to undergo any resective surgery. And this is true. There are some patients that don't want to have open head procedure. And the question here is, of course, that if we can show that hippocampal Dbs has a similar outcome than resective surgery, then what patients would prefer, to go to resective surgery or to a neuromodulatory procedure? But this is open to discussion, and we still don't have the adequate data. This is how we do it. We have a posterior entry point, and we use a longitudinal entry from the posterior, and we cover most of the hippocampus with a single electrode. If you see the comparison of the different DBS techniques, you're going to see that although there are different populations, as I mentioned, but anyway, hippocampal stimulation is the one who provides better seizure frequency control compared to the others. Include not only on the seizure frequency reduction, but on the numbers of patients who got seizure-free. And listen, 44% of people seizure-free, these are patients who are not candidates for resective surgery or have failed them, and medications too. So 44% of seizure-free patients is pretty good. And we put this together with a prospective control double-blind study showing that hippocampal stimulation is actually very effective, and you could expect at least 50% of the patients seizure-free are dead. And this just put these 3 techniques together. It's very easy to see how the response with hippocampal stimulation in patients with temporal lobe epilepsy is better controlled to the previous studies. I would like now to focus on vagus nerve stimulation because I think vagus nerve stimulation has been better studied from many perspectives, including cost effectiveness and outcome scales. And it provides a model for us to understand some peculiarities of neuromodulation. Vagus nerve stimulation is obviously done by stimulating the vagus nerve in the neck. This goes directly into the nucleus of the tratus solitarius, and this has a major input to the locus ceruleus, which it's mainly noradrenergic, and then we get back to the noradrenergic seizure control mechanism, and then it goes out spread to the cortex, but it's basically a noradrenergic control system. As in any other type of neuromodulatory technique, we need to understand why people respond differently. Well, in vagus nerve stimulation, they might respond differently, not only because they have different epileptic syndromes, but because their vagus nerve is different. Their fascicles, the disposition of the fascicles are different. And then you might need different types of stimulation for different distribution of the fibers within the nerve. It's the same as saying that you have to be in the correct part of the central median or the anterior nucleus to have a good result. And here is the same thing. You have to be in a position to stimulate adequately the vagus nerve. The procedure is quite simple. We use 2 small incisions, one in the neck and one in the infraclavicular region. There are other people that use the infraaxillary incision, but we prefer this. It's quite simple. I brought a very quick movie for those of you that have never seen one of these procedures and how it looks like. We always use a microscope, although there are some groups that would use a loop, for instance, but we are very microsurgically prone, so we use a microscope. And what you are seeing there is the vagus nerve in the middle, and you notice that there is a small piece of tissue attached to the nerve, and this is the perineural tissue. And you have, and this is the carotid artery, by the way. And this is the jugular vein. So the vagus nerve is in between the carotid arteries and the jugular vein. But I have to mention that you have to keep this perineural tissue intact, because this is how the vascular supply to the nerve comes from. So if you damage this thing, you're probably going to damage the nerve. And if you're doing a stimulation of a nerve and you just damage it, the results are not going to be good. I have seen all types of bad manipulations of the nerve. There are people who stretch the nerve like crazy, and this is going to just simply damage the axons that are there. And there are people who take all this perineural vascular sheet out, and this is going to damage the neuro, so don't do that. As you can see, we have no retraction here. We don't use any type of retraction on the skin or any other structures. And what you're seeing here is the actual electrodes. It's comprised of 3 modules. This one is the first module, and you are seeing that there's no contact, no electrode in this one. And this is just a support module of the electrode, and you have to wrap it over the nerve, and then you just put it down, and then come the next two. You see there one that's going to act as a cathode, and the other one is going to act as an anode, and then you have to wrap them again around the nerve. And please be gentle with the nerve. You need it alive and healthy if you are planning to stimulate it adequately. And more to the end, I just want to show you. This is the final situation. You see that all the contacts were being installed. And then you can just connect it. Here is the final situation, and then I'm just connected to the generator in the second incision that I've shown you. We start programming these patients 2 or 3 weeks after implantation when the sutures are out. We use a final intensity which is higher than that proposed by the company. We go up to 3.5 milliamps. And we increase it in a higher and faster way than that proposed by the company. We use increments of 0.5 milliamps every week, which is much faster than the one first proposed by the company. One thing that you have to understand while we're talking of VNS and neuromodulation and palliative neuromodulation is that we need to use the adequate scales to rate them. If you use a scale that was designed for resections, this is not going to be useful, because if you are talking about palliative procedures, all patients will start with angle 3. So if you are going to use angle scales, you're not going to be able to derive any benefit from any procedure that is palliative, not only neuromodulation. So you should use the scales designed to rate palliative procedures, such as the Manhug scale, but you can use or develop anyone, but it needs to be different from the angle scale, for instance. Vagus nerve stimulation has been proven to exist in many series. And it's fair to say that you would expect like 60% of the patients having at least 50% of seizure frequency reduction. And this is very, let's say, very significant in terms of you can repeat this kind of results in many centers and over different populations. And again, you can also see that VNS results improve significantly over the years. So, and when you see this, you will be tempted to believe that this is due to progressive the modulation of progressive neuromodulation of the epileptic network. And this is really likely the case, and it's not seen only on VNS, it's also seen in DBS, although, of course, the numbers of patients submitted to VNS are much larger than those submitted presently to DBS. The other intriguing thing is that VNS has been used in many different types of seizures and syndromes. But this is intriguing for me because after 100,000 patients submitted to VNS, I would like to have a better understanding of what kind of patients are really the best candidates for VNS. Because if we cannot make this decision after 100,000 patients, and we need to put more effort on this thing. But this, in fact, is useful in many types of situations. It was seen by us and others that the pediatric population seemed to have a better result after VNS. And over the last 10 years, we have specifically been studying the pediatric population submitted to VNS. And we started by homogenizing populations. So we are not going to be doing it in every single patient or every single epileptic syndrome, but we put much emphasis on patients that are very refractory, and they are really trouble for the neurologists and the pediatric neurologists, which are the patients with Lennox-Gastaut. And we've shown initially that those patients with Lennox-Gastaut submitted to VNS has intriguing good results, very good results. 90% of them improved at least 50% in seizure frequency. And there was an attention improvement that was not necessarily related to seizure control, but probably related to the activation of the noradrenergic system. In these patients, we have seen that not only seizures were reduced, but as you can see here, many seizure types simply disappeared. And this is very important because these patients are the patients that you repeatedly see on the emergency departments and things like that. And it's very frequent that patients that have 6 or 7 ER admissions per year, and after VNS, they simply don't, they keep seizing, but they don't go to the emergency room again. And this is very relevant in terms of quality of life, especially for the caretakers or parents. We went on to compare vagus nerve stimulation with callosotomy, and because they are kind of competing for the same patients, for the secondary generalized patients with Lennox-Gastaut, and we concluded that if your main seizure type are atonic seizures, then callosotomy is better than VNS to start with. But if the main seizure pattern is not atonic seizures, you're better to start with VNS, and if necessary, then you can go to callosotomy. You can do it in each way, but definitely if it's atonic, we start with callosotomy, and if the other types, we start with VNS. When you talk about palliative procedures, you need to see beyond seizures. And this is what it's really about. If you look into quality of life after VNS, it's very easy. Well, if you treat patients with this kind of syndromes and VNS, it's very easy for you to know because you know the families and the patients. But if you see it as a whole population, it's very clear that quality of life is really improved in these patients, and this is very useful. And one of the parts is that I just mentioned, the ER admissions. But the other things that we need to look into palliative procedures are things like is the rate of the mortality rate or the SUDEP rate. And what we know about VNS is there is a definitely diminution of the mortality rates in these patients. And but we are not yet sure that this kind of neuromodulation would decrease SUDEP rates. But it's kind of reasonable to suspect that whenever you diminish seizure frequency, you are more prone to go in the direction of diminishing seizure. But mortality is definitely reduced by VNS. Another way of looking into if your procedure is good or not is looking into the reimplantation rates. And VNS have a very large, a very high reimplantation rate, meaning that for any reasons or for any time and place, people approve the treatment. It's 71 is it's a very large reimplantation rate. Here, what we are seeing is the resource utilization after VNS. And this is part of what I was saying to you, but not on a personal basis, but on the basis of a large pool of patients with VNS. And what you can see, the four first bars on the left are basically related to hospitalizations and inpatient periods and etc. And what you see is that VNS is clearly related to a reduce on the hospital use for these patients. And this is really clearly welcomed by these families. And in here, we can see the cumulative adjusted net health for cost related to VNS, and it's obvious compared to medical treatment. And obviously, at the beginning, VNS is more expensive because you have to pay for the device, and the device might be very expensive in some countries. But after year 4 or 5, due to the less use of the hospitals and ICUs and etc., you can clearly see that there is an adjustment of a cost-effectiveness of VNS, and it surpassed medical treatment alone. Of course, these patients are still taking drugs and being treated medically, but the number of the use of the health system is much lower in the long term when these patients are using VNS. We did have complications with VNS, but the only one who really bothers me is sleep apnea. I think you have to pay attention to these. If you should think that your patient has sleep apnea, so you have to, you have to take attention, and it might be complicated. Our best results with VNS are in patients with secondary bilateral generalized epilepsy and extratemporal epilepsy. And our worst result actually are those for temporal lobe epilepsy, especially in those patients who failed temporal lobe resection, which is bad news because we would like to have an alternative for those patients who have failed temporal lobe resections. Recently, a closed loop stimulation system based on cardiac frequency has been introduced by the producer, and it's based on the fact that many, especially complex partial seizures, have an increase in seizures in cardiac frequency immediately before or during the seizure. There were 2 studies, one over the Atlantic, one in Belgium and the other one in the US, which showed that as a proof of concept that the system was doing what it was intended to do, meaning it starts stimulation when the hertz frequency goes up, and they are not intended to prolong follow-up, but they suggested that there might be improvement in the long-term follow-up. But then we had 2 studies, one by Hamilton, and which is this one, which were also it's not a very good design for level 1 evidence, but again, it suggested that when you go from cardiac-based VNS stimulation, you can get better results than with regular VNS. But again, these studies are not the perfect design to prove that. The other study is from Zadok, and she again proposed and suggested that the use of closed loop VNS stimulation would yield additional effects compared to regular VNS. So this is very interesting, and we need to follow up on this and design adequate studies. Just in the last minutes, I'd like to share with you our passion for treating this pediatric population. And it's important because they have different causes, but they have functional plasticity, which help us treating them. This is one patient that had West syndrome and followed by Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. He has corpus callosum agenesis on MRI, so corpus callosotomy was not an option here. He underwent VNS at the age of 5 with an amazing reduction in seizure frequency, and then he became seizure-free for 3 years with an attention improvement, and suddenly there was a worsening of the seizures, and we noticed battery depletion, and VNS was reimplanted, and he's seizure-free again. And why this is important? This is important because this is a proof of concept in humans. You need to keep stimulating them to keep them healthy and better regarding symptoms. This is a 10-year-old boy with Angelman syndrome. So just to mention that if people have genetic syndromes, this doesn't mean that they don't have to be treated. This is an error. It's not because we know that there is a gene or etc. that you should not treat this patient. You should treat this patient with whatever tool you have because they're really refractory. And this kid, he had the callosotomy before, and then he has this funny thing that he was able, he's playing with himself, and he triggers an absent seizure. You should see they're going to stop the movement, and when he stopped the moving, this is the seizure. So he was able to obtain reflex absent seizures because he felt good during the absence. It's difficult to tell why, but this is what it is. And this is the kid, again, it's an Angelman syndrome, and this is a couple of years after VNS, and he's starting to walk. And of course, you see that he is cognitively impaired and he has a neurological problem. But for a family with a kid with Angelman syndrome, this is something very, very impressive. This is again another syndrome, the Natick Syndrome, the SCN8A syndrome. Somehow we managed to put together a large series of these patients in Sao Paulo. And when we met this kid, he was a baby, totally hypotonic, did nothing. It's a really bad kid with SCN8A, one of the worst that we've got. And he was treated with sodium blockers, sodium channel blockers, and VNS. And this is how he was when he was months old. A very, very bad kid, really. And this is him last year. And again, you can notice that there is cognitive impairment, but for parents of a SCN8A kid, this is really an achievement. We have been studying the use of concomitant use of VNS and DBS. It is possible, and it's very likely that they would increment seizure control. It's not clear which procedure should go first right now. I would say that VNS, it's a useful palliative procedure, and you should expect at least 60% of seizure frequency reduction, and more of that if you treat homogenized subpopulations such as Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. I just want to spend 1 or 2 minutes, if you allow me to do so, talking about the future directions. We are going to be using more and more robots. There are nowadays many types of robots. I just brought 2 of them, is the Rosa and the Neuromate. They are going to help us while inserting electrodes. They are very useful to help in stereotactic procedures. We are now trying, there is a group in Japan teaching robots how to handle forceps and knives. So we are now in the position of starting to teach the robots how the human hand works. And when we are able to do that, then we are going to get more and more, see more and more of the robots in neuromodulation and in neurosurgery. We are going to be seeing more and more of multimodal electrodes. These are being developed in many labs throughout the world. As you can see, this comes from a journal that's is nothing related to neurology or medicine. It's just engineering, and we are going to be able not only to record the energy, record spikes, but we are going to be able to record metabolites, and we have a better understanding of the metabolites of the foci and the relay stations and everything, and that is going to yield better understanding and better neuromodulatory procedures. Dennis Spencer has been playing with this multimodal electrodes, and they are developing one, and this is part of an early publication from his group, but this is something that we are going to be hearing more and more. Artificial intelligence and deep learning is going to be part of the life of those who are in neuromodulation. We will have devices that are going to help us to rate and recognize seizures in our patients. There is already a number of devices that can do that. We are talking about universities, startups, homemade devices, but everything that is capable of telling us when the seizure is starting. But as far as we know, when they're helping, what we are going to be doing is to train our devices to recognize their seizures in a better way. And then we are going to implant these patients chronically and let them live their lives. And we are going to be give the opportunity to the device to learn how does his brain work, and then to try to treat them. Chronic electroencephalography is definitely something that we are going to be seeing in the future. It can be used to localize foci preoperatively for a resection, for instance. It can be used for localizing foci networks for neuromodulation. It can be used to just document the effectiveness of the medical treatment. You see patient 1 responded to a drug, and patient 2 did not respond to a drug. So there are many uses for chronic electrocorticography, and this is something that we're going to be doing more and more in the future, meaning that we're going to implant the patient and then send them home. Instead of just seeing them for 1 or 2 weeks with invasive recordings, we're just going to send them home, and we'll see. Well, let's record for a month or 2, and then we can decide. Closed loop stimulation is the future. Though the paradigms that we have today are not very good, and the hardware is still not very good, but the idea of closed loop stimulation is there and is the future, and we have to pursue it. It goes for extracranial stimulation like VNS, or intracranial stimulation like DBS or responsive neuromodulation. And for the future, I suppose that we are going to be seeing much more modulation, neuromodulation, and I hope many more people would get involved in this field. If you have, for instance, in the technical issue that I was not able to touch in this presentation due to time, we have the pleasure to edit this with Gordon Balter from University of Pennsylvania, so you can look into this and you'll have all the technical details on the procedures. And for those who are technically interested, and I suppose are the surgeons in the end, in the audience, we have our main technical meeting, which is held every 2 years, and this year has been postponed for a reason that you can imagine, but you can be alerted, and if you can be there, it's a good opportunity to discuss every technical issue with us. With this, I'd like to thank you again. I'm really honored to be with you, and I hope I was able to review the neuromodulation present and future aspects. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kukier. That was really good. It was a good review. It was skilled, timely, comprehensive. Makes you feel like you're the Neymar of epilepsy since you're from Brazil. We do have a few questions. We may go a few minutes over time. So if you allow me, I will start choosing some questions for you. But before we go to the questions that are about the topic, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping questions here, and I will answer them both in Arabic and English. People who ask about CME hours from the Saudi Council of Health Specialties, I just want everyone to know that the Saudi Epilepsy Society will be applying for the hours. Processing may take time, and but hopefully we will be able to get the hours eventually. We don't have them for now. The certificates for this attendance will be sent to you shortly in your email addresses. So بالعربي اللي بالنسبة للساعات نحن قدمنا بالطلب على هيئة السعودية للخصائص الصحية، وننتظر إنه إن شاء الله نعطي الساعات بأثر رجعي، ولكن هذا لم يتم بعد. أما الشهادات فترسل لكم على الإيميل إن شاء الله. The other question is whether people will get access to this material, and this is already has been on YouTube Live and will be on YouTube for people to consult later on. All right, so a couple of questions here. We'll try to hit some high yield questions. A question from Dr. Dua Baarma, about your experience of using DBS in children, Professor Kukier.
Well, we use DBS for children frequently, so there is no major difference than adults, except in very young kids when the skull is not rigid enough to hold a frame. So from a technical point of view, it's not much difference. All the patients that we submit to central median stimulation for Lennox-Gastaut are basically kids. So we don't have any problem with them. Anterior nucleus stimulation is basically for adults because the type of epilepsy that it's treating is it's basically frontotemporal epilepsy, and hippocampal stimulation is also for young adults and a little bit older people. So right now, the main target that using kids is central median stimulation. I don't see much of a difficulty. Surprisingly, we expected that we will have many electro fractures because the kids, they run and they fall and etc. But this so far it has not been the case. So I don't think it's the youngest kid that we did central median stimulation was a 2-year-old kid in generalized status due to Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. But I don't see much of a difference in this regard.
Okay, a very clear answer. Another question here about what do you worry about with hippocampal stimulation in terms of complications, side effects? And the question also asks if how you can rule out a lesional effect of the electrodes as opposed to a stimulatory effect or modulatory effect.
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
What you worry about in terms of side effects and complications, yes.
Well, you know, when you talk about temporal lobe epilepsy and hippocampal stimulation is used in temporal lobe epilepsy, the main concern here is always memory. You know? It concerns the patient, it concerns the neurologist, so the main problem that we expected to deal with was memory deficit due to stimulation, especially in those patients that we are submitting to bilateral stimulation, because we have half of our patients are receiving bilateral hippocampal stimulation. But surprisingly, we don't see additional memory deficits in these patients, and as a matter of fact, they improve. Many of them improve in memory, meaning that we are not, as I mentioned before, we are not inhibiting totally the hippocampus, because if we inhibited totally bilaterally the hippocampus, we are going to run into deep memory problems. This is not the UC. You see actually, either you don't see anything getting worse or you see improvement. There are other groups that have seen improvement with the direct stimulation of the fornix. So it does make sense of memory. So it does make sense that we don't have our main worries are related to memory. But fortunately, we were able to see and consider and prove that in the way we are doing, we don't have additional memory problems. And the second part was, can you get it again?
The second part is, I guess, how do you know that whatever seizure benefit you're getting is not just because of the lesional effect? Yeah.
The lesion effect. You are correct. There is a lesional effect when you do hippocampal Dbs. And this lesional effect is usually 3 to 4 weeks, but it can be longer. And that's why when you are designing a study on hippocampal Dbs, you have to allow your patients to get back to their previous seizure frequency before you stimulate. Otherwise, you are going to contaminate your results. And that's why we did in our studies. Contrary to what they did at the Sante and the NeuroPace, we allowed 2 months of recovery. And the patient needed to get back to their seizure frequency. Otherwise, they are excluded from the study because if you include them, you're going to get seizure-free patients that are not seizure-free because of stimulation, but with the lesional effect. That being said, we have 2 patients with hippocampal stimulation that they have been seizure-free since insertion. And they are 3 and 4 years respectively after surgery and have never had a seizure after the implantation with no stimulation. These are not, obviously, this is not the majority. It's 2 out of 40 patients, so it's 5%. But this has also been noticed by Schulz-Bonange in Germany in one of their patients. So that's true. There is a lesional effect, and there is a lesional effect that might be long, but it's usually lasts for 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay. One sort of more basic question here, and then I think depending on the answer we may end after, and I apologize for the other questions, and I promise that we'll try to answer them if there are comments under the YouTube. I will try to get them to you, Professor, if you have time later. So the basic question goes like this. Why the vagus nerve? Why not other cranial nerves? And how do you choose which neuromodulation method to choose for this particular patient? It's sort of we're catering to different levels of questions. So the question is, why the vagus nerve as opposed to the other cranial nerves? And when do you choose VNS? When do you choose DBS, and so on?
Well, I was not the one that took the decision to start with the vagus nerve, but I think it's a reasonable good choice because the vagus nerve is basically an efferent nerve. And since what we would like to do is to stimulate from extracranially outside the brain and get into the brain, it would be better to use a nerve that is mainly afferent to the brain. There are other options like the optic nerve, but you're not going to be willing to stimulate the optic nerve because you're going to get visual things, and stimulation of the vagus nerve does not give you any objective phenomenon because it's basically a visceral efferent nerve. So I think that the choice of the nerve, it's a good one if what you intend to do is to stimulate from extracranially and try to reach the brain. The other question is regarding the paradigms for stimulation and which kind of population would be the best candidate. I would say that at least in our hands, the best results were really in kids with generalized epilepsy. I would say that presently the treatment of these kids would need VNS at some point. It's very difficult for me to understand why not any patient with Lennox-Gastaut would not get VNS at some point. Because you're going to treat them with drugs, and then you can treat them with ketogenic diet, and then you can treat them with callosotomy, and they still keep seizing. And at this point, or before or after callosotomy, you should consider VNS, because this is, in our experience, the best patient population for this. The other fortunate population are those that have bilateral brain disease, like bilateral polymicrogyrus, or bilateral cortical dysplasia, or bilateral periventricular nodal heterotopia, and they are not candidates for resective surgery, or they are very poor candidates for resective surgery. So I think VNS should be considered in this patient populations. There is no data so far comparing VNS to TBS. It's likely that if you have, it's likely to consider, but there is no data there. It's likely to consider that if you have temporal lobe epilepsy and you can go directly to the temporal lobe, it should be better than VNS. But again, VNS and this extra cranial procedure and hippocampal stimulation is safe, but this is still intracranial. So you have to ponder this kind of thing. Regarding paradigms of stimulation, I think we are actually in a very bad position because we didn't do the adequate work to use different paradigms. Presently, vagus nerve stimulation is used by means of cycling paradigm, meaning that you stimulate, for instance, for 30 seconds and you turn it off for 5 minutes, and etc. But there is no neurobiological reason for doing that, other than doing it from continuous, for instance. There's no study comparing continuous stimulation with cycling stimulation using VNS, or let me tell you, it's true also for DBS. We use continuous DBS in our patients, but there are other groups that use cycling stimulation for their patients. But it's not yet there, and we do need to design adequate studies to further elaborate on which kind of paradigm is better. The use of closed-loop VNS, the one based on cardiac frequency increase, it's likely to give patients more stimulation than regular VNS. Patients with regular VNS, they usually get 261 cycles per day because they stimulate 30 seconds and they go off for 5 minutes. And if you put in the number, the computational number is 261 cycles. If you're using closed loop stimulation, you'll get more than this. And depending on how more than this you get, it will represent the same as using a heavy duty cycle. And we still don't know. We still need to gather data. And I think in the very, very near future, we are going to start seeing this data coming out.
Very, very good. Thank you. I will add to that, people tried stimulating the trigeminal nerve. So just like you said, the idea is just how do you get in? You don't necessarily, there's nothing magical about the vagus nerve per se. There's a couple of other questions that I promise that we'll put the answers on the comment section in the YouTube. Before closing, I'll ask you one sort of humorous question. Being an expert in neuromodulation and neurostimulation, how far are we from being robots controlled by machines put in our heads and so on?
Well, it's not for my lifetime.
Although it feels like it right now. We have 800 people, and the two of us and the panel are sort of digital beings interacting on the World Wide Web in the cloud.
What I think that one of the things that are really we are gonna be seeing is not exactly being controlled, but being in control. I think brain interface techniques would allow us, especially for those with spinal cord paralysis, tetraparesis, or paraplegic people, they would be able, as far as we know how the language of the neurons there, we are going to be able to activate exoscheletons in the near future. But I don't see, as far as epilepsy goes, that we are going to be in control. But what I can foresee are better paradigms for seizure detection and stimulation in a closed loop way. And this is going to certainly be based on chronic electrocorticography. I'm pretty sure that in 10 or 15 years, we are not going to be doing invasive recordings in the way we do today. What we do today, we implant depth electrodes, or we implant subdural electrodes, and then we take out the medications and we record seizures. It takes 1 week or two, and then we take our decisions and what to do with the patients. I really think that in the very near future, we are going to be just implanting them, sending them home, looking at them for months, and then deciding. And this is important, because if you look into the data from NeuroPace, the time to the appearance of a contralateral seizure is 21 days, or from 21 to 40. It means that what we are doing in 1 or 2 weeks, you're just going to be seeing seizures coming from one side anyway. And we cannot, you cannot keep the patients with the hardware out for 40 days. It's simply not feasible. And then chronic electrocorticography, we are learning more, and we are going to be able to define more wisely and what to do with these patients.
Yeah, Andy Cole and his group had just had this paper in epilepsy the other day about how they followed NeuroPace with temporal lobectomies based on what they were able to record chronically, which is really great. Well, tell you what, digital or not digital, this has been really educational and fun. And I would like to, we can close by first thanking you very much. I enjoyed it as much as did the 600 something people that are still here. These are blessed days around here. So we're glad that you're sharing them with us with knowledge and science that helps our patients. I would also like to extend thanks to the Saudi Epilepsy Society board and to LivaNova for graciously supporting this event. And I will leave the last words to you, sir.
I'd just like to thank you again, Tayeb. I was really honored, and I do hope I have managed to get people interested in neuromodulation. And as a matter of fact, I do hope to, as you know, I am an old-fashioned face-to-face guy. And, and I hope that in the near future, after this madness, we're going to be able to be together face-to-face and greet each other as we usually did.
Yes, yes. Hopefully the world will be rid of this COVID-19 and we'll all experience the joy of life again, basically, in the outdoors and meeting together in big meetings and so on and so forth. So thank you so much again. Thank you for the attendance. Sorry we went a little bit over time, but it was for a good cause. And with this, we can end the webinar. Thank you so much, Professor Coquier.
Thank you.
Bye now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Haitham. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for our attendees. I'm just sending the link of YouTube right now. For anyone can go to see the presentation anytime.
Yes, and we will try to answer some of the questions and the links there. I just had a couple of remaining questions there to answer, so we can answer them there.
Okay, now we are